while rich countries give $130 billion in aid to poor countries, rich countries actually take out a whole lot more. For example, $200 billion goes from those poor countries to rich countries in the form of interest on international loans. $500 billion is repatriated from the poor countries by multinational corporations. And $1 trillion in illicit financial flows goes from poor countries to rich countries in the form of tax havens and transfer pricing. This is from Jason Hickel in a podcast I heard. So the idea that poor countries have some sort of inherent cultural problem that causes them to not be able to prosper in society is just not true. It's basically continued colonialism, just less violent. And this kind of connects to my general theory of politics, which is a leftist theory. I was just thinking about politics and how it's really complicated, but I find it fascinating. I think it's complicated because you have facts, right? So everybody has facts that they can use to understand the world. And then you have competing ideologies and narratives around what happened and why it happened historically. And then you have the competing ideology on how we should go forward. And so like you basically have people disagreeing on what happened and what causes things. And then that leads to further complications. So it's really hard to understand what's going on in this world, and especially when it comes to politics, because you just have people literally competing on reality almost. And also the world is complicated to understand. Like even if you didn't have politics and you didn't have competing ideologies, it would just be hard to understand because there's so many variables, right? But I do feel like I'm starting to have kind of like a little bit more of a cohesive kind of leftist view on understanding the world. And one thing I've realized is neoliberalism gets thrown out a lot. And I think I understand it. I'm not completely sure, but the way I understand neoliberalism is it has nothing to do with American liberalism. It's not about people that care about minorities and social services. It really refers to liberalism as it was first envisioned, basically democracy and free markets. And to neo, kind of new, or it's kind of like a re-understanding of liberalism in response to the opposite of free markets to some degree that came around in the early 20th century. So you had basically, this is how I understand it, I'm not sure if it's right, but you had in America in particular, capitalism, very little regulation. Then you had, and I don't even know the order, but you have like a dust bowl. So agriculture is kind of falling out of production and people don't have food to eat. Then you have a stock market system collapse because it's not regulated well enough. And so in response to that deregulated system, have people like Truman and Roosevelt who came in and said, look, we need social services, we need to regulate capitalism and make it less free in a sense. So that's the opposite to some degree of liberalism. And so that went on for some time. And then what happened is in the 80s, you had kind of the backlash to this less free market in the form of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. This is where neoliberalism comes in. And this is where you see, unions busted more, you see deregulation, and this has continued until today. And the leftist perspective is that this is causing a lot of problems, and I basically agree. Thanks for watching. I'm John Breyer.